Alright, here we are. Today we're going to do some air work. We're going to do level turns, we're going to do climbing turns, and we're going to do descending turns. And then we'll come back south of the field, fly up north on the east side of the field, join the left downwind landing runway 020. And I'll explain what we're doing all that time. So for starters, we're going to review some of the instruments here. Remember that we have the airspeed indicator. We're going to be taking off at 60, cruising at about 90 to 100, climbing and landing at about 70, climbing maybe up to 80, depending on our load. All right, there's the outside of the plane. And just to review, the surface controls. There's the flaps at the different settings. We'll be using 20 degrees flap landing, which is not the full amount. And it's about normal for normal landings. Ailerons, left aileron and right aileron. You can see how the deflections make the wings go left or right into a roll. The elevator, pitching down and pitching up. And the rudder for yaw control, left rudder, right rudder. Now, carb heat and mixture and airspeed and the artificial horizon and the altitude. We're at 860 feet. Well, at least we should be, so let's readjust this. There we go. It changes with air pressure. These two instruments are for instrument landing and navigation. Vertical speed indicator, 500 feet above and 500 feet descending and 1,000. The gyro compass is the same as the magnetic compass, and the magnetic compass is the standard, but it spins during turns and descents and climbs, so the gyro stabilizes and it's more useful for finding our headings, but it has to be reset every few minutes, like every 10 minutes or so, with the magnetic compass during level flight. The turn and bank indicator, the little airplane turns or banks left or right, shows you the degree. The little white line is 20 degrees. The ball is the slip and skid indicator. So if the ball goes to the right, you step on the ball with the right rudder, which will coordinate the turn. If the ball's on the left, you step on the left rudder to coordinate the turn. Remember that a slip is when you are sliding inside the turn, and a skid is when you skid outside of the turn. Okay, toe brakes. So make sure your heels are on the floor and your toes are on the bottom of the pedals for rudder. You slip them up when you want to use the brakes. They're differential brakes. The brakes are on the top of the rudder. Okay, our parking brake is off. What else should we be looking at? Well, let's see. We're going to do a normal climb out with a left turn at 500 feet, and we'll climb to 3,000 feet into the practice area, heading due west. So here we go. Engine torque, compensate by right rudder, and away we go. When we get up to 60 knots, we'll pull back firmly, but slowly, on the yoke, and the trim wheel should be set at takeoff, so it should automatically trim out at 500 feet a minute with hands off the controls. That's if you maintain your climb. There we go. We'll let it settle out at a steady climb of 500 feet a minute. Airspeed's good, and it'll settle out. So once we're at 1,386, which is 500 feet above the ground, we'll start our left turn to due west. So carb heat is off, flaps are at 0. The carb heat, like I said, is used only when the RPM drops below the green sector. So the engine's not developing much heat, so we blow hot air into the carb to minimize the chance of carb ice forming. always done when the engine RPM is below the green sector. So we're climbing up past 500 feet, heading due west. Yeah, airplane's trimmed out, so we don't have to work the yoke too much. As a matter of fact, keeping your hand or hands on the yoke will force the pitch up or down. You won't even know it. So you don't do it like in the movies. Oh, there's Turtle Lake and there's the airport at 7 o'clock. What you do is a light touch with your fingers. You try not to touch the yoke at all if you can. That's what I do. I'll tweak it up with my finger if I have to. Now pitch is very sensitive, so you correct it usually with the trim wheel. See? A little bit of movement really makes it jump around, so you don't want to keep your hand on the yoke. On the other hand, aileron, you can move it a lot more dramatically. So if a gust of wind kicks me over to the left or right, I'll correct the aileron very abruptly with my finger. But I try to trim the plane on a climb or on a cruise or on a descent where I don't have to hold the yoke. So we're at 2,200 feet, so we've got a ways to go to 3,000. We're maintaining our heading. Well, we're off a little bit to the right, but that's okay. I'll correct that when I get up there. Doesn't really matter. We're heading off to the practice area. Although, best advice I can give you is that if you can fly a plane at a heading of 280 degrees, you can darn well fly it at a heading of 270, which is what we were supposed to do. So you always should try to fly the numbers. Make sure you're disciplined and precise. Maintain your altitudes, maintain your headings. You can't get sloppy. So full power, no flaps, carb heat's full off. Climbing at 500 to 800 feet a minute with the gusty winds and the thermals. Airspeed's at 80, so we're well within fast limits there. And we're coming up to 3,000 feet. When we do, we will nose over, like right now, get the airspeed up, and then pull the RPM back to 2250 or 2300 RPM, which is cruise RPM. And then retrim the plane. So that's what we're doing now, retrimming the plane. Get everything settled, like it'll oscillate for a bit. Let everything settle out, and then retrim so you don't have to touch the yoke. You don't want to have to keep pushing it or pulling back on it for level flight. You'll never go anywhere that way. You won't last long. So we're getting there. Don't worry if we trim it out not quite at 3,000 feet, because then what you can do once it's trimmed is you can just pull back on the yoke, bring it up to altitude. Sure, the plane will slow down a bit, but once you're at altitude, without touching the trim, it'll go back to level flight. What you don't want to do is chase the controls. Let the plane react, give it time. Okay, let's start our level turn to the left. Maintain altitude. We're going to do a 180, 20-degree bank, maybe to compensate for the loss in lift, because when the plane banks, the wing angle, the lift vector is smaller. So you need a bit of power and maybe pull back on the stick a tiny bit to keep your altitude. And don't forget the rudder, keep the ball in the center. So we're heading due west, we're at altitude, and we'll start our left turn. 20 degrees bank angle. A space between the horizon and the nose of the plane really helps. So we're maintaining 3,000 feet. The airspeed is very good. We're not letting the bank get away on us. It's not too steep. And we're going to roll out due east. So we're going to end up heading exactly back where we came from. Altitude is 3,000 feet. Bank angle is still at 20 degrees. Airspeed is good. So we're always monitoring the instruments. RPM is at cruise, maybe a bit above for the turn, and level out on east. Put the RPM back where it was, and you don't have to retrim the plane. You shouldn't have to, because everything's back the way it was when we're heading west. So it should go back to flying straight and level, hands-free. So we're going to try a turn to the right this time. We're going to go due south, so a 90-degree turn, not a 180. Maintain 3,000 feet, 20-degree bank angle, heading south. So as you can see, the ailerons, if you catch a gust, you can move them fairly violently. Well, violently is not the right word, but abruptly to get it back to level. But pitch is very sensitive. So pulling back and pushing forward on the plane will knock you right out of your seat. So you very, very, very light touch on pitch. Usually the trim wheel does the trick. So 20-degree right bank angle, maintain 3,000 feet, maintain airspeed, bit more RPM to maintain altitude, and maybe pull back on the stick just a smidge to maintain altitude, and roll out due south at altitude. Okay, rolling out south 3,000 feet, and again, if you put the RPM back to 2,300, you shouldn't have to retrim the plane. Change anything, airspeed, pitch angle, anything, and you got to retrim the plane eventually, but we're back to where it was, so it should be okay. So now we're going to try some climbing turns. Now that's pretty easy because you just pull full power, 500 feet climb, just like you're taking off from the runway. And the trick is we're going to be turning 90 degrees and we're going to be climbing 500 feet. So let's see if we can ending up with both at our targets at the same time, but it's really not necessary. It's just good discipline. If you get to one first, like if you get to your heading first, level out and continue your climb. There's nothing wrong with that. So we'll see. It all depends on how fast you turn and how fast you climb. Bit of power, full power, pitch up 500 feet, and we're going to turn to a heading of due east, climbing at 500 feet per minute, ending up at an altitude of 3,500 feet. So we're climbing 500 feet, heading due east. So full power, climbing at 500 feet per minute, and up we go. Bank angle about 20 degrees. Airspeed's good at about 85, 90. Coming up on due east, so level the plane and continue the climb. So that's a climbing turn. This, of course, is just normal climb. Once we get up to 3,500, or just before, pitch forward, level the plane, RPM or airspeed climbs, then pull the RPM back to cruise, which is 2250 to 2300 RPM. Now we didn't change the trim wheel, so it should go back to level flight trim. But check it, make sure. Now our position, you can see the airport at our 10 o'clock, so we're right just over Turtle Lake to the south. So let's try a climbing turn to the right, heading due south. Full power, pull up, 500 feet a minute, bank angle 20 degrees, roll out at south at 4,000 feet. Now all of this time the RPM's in the green or higher, so the carb heat is full off. And mixture is full rich because we're not high enough where the air is thin enough that we require to pull back on the amount of fuel. So we're rolling out due south, climbing another 25 or 250 feet to 4,000. Airspeed's good, heading's good. We're getting there on altitude, and climb rate's 500 feet a minute, full RPM. Okay, once we reach 4,000 or just before, pitch it forward to level flight, let the airspeed climb up, and pull back on the RPM to 2,300. And we should be, again, still trimmed for level flight. You shouldn't have to play with it. The less you have to change, the better. Let the plane react to your movements. If you start moving things before the plane reacts, you'll be doing it all day, and you'll make your passengers airsick. So, carb heat off, we're going to do descending turns. So carb heat full on, we're pull the power down to 1500 RPM, descend at 500 feet a minute, turn at a 20-degree bank angle, and we're going to drop down to 3,500 feet. And a right turn. We're going to pull out due west. Airspeed's good. 500 feet a minute, descending. RPM is out of the green, so we got the carb heat on. We've reached 3,500 feet, and we also rolled out due wests right at the same time. Power up to 2,300. Now we're going to keep the carb heat on because we're going to do some more descending turns. Now with the carb heat on, the RPM's a little lower, so the trim might be a bit off, but we're not going to change it because we're immediately going to go into another descent turn. Okay, so level flight corrected, everything's good. Heading due west at altitude 3,500, perfect. Now let's try a turn in the other direction. Throttle back to 1,500 RPM, turn left, heading eventually due south, 500 feet rate of climb, descending. Let the instruments react. It's coming back up to 500. And you know what? Let's keep going. The airport's behind us. It'll put us in better position. Let's do a complete 180 turn. So we'll end up at due east. And let's drop right down to 2,500 feet. So we're at due east. Yeah, that way we don't have to go so far to the airport. So that was a 180 turn, and we're approaching 2,500 feet. But it's no problem. We didn't change anything. We just did it longer. Okay, throttle up to cruise, level the plane, due east, 2,500 feet, cruise RPM and carb heat off because we're back in the green. So now we're gonna, there's Turtle Lake, and the airport is just under the strut. So pretty soon we're going to do a level left-hand turn, maintaining 2,500 feet. So we maintain RPM, maybe put a bit on, pitch back a tiny bit to maintain altitude. Airspeed's good, and we'll roll out at a heading of 020, which is parallel to the runway. So if you see ahead, the runway's at 11 o'clock, just to the west of the road. Turtle Lake's at our 10. So we're going to fly up to the east of the runway until it's right beside us, turn left, straight over the middle of the field at circuit altitude, join the downwind, land runway 20. Now I might start a very gradual descent down to 2,200 feet. Now how I'm doing that is I just pulled a bit of power, not quite cruise, a little less. So we've got a descent of about 100 or 200 feet a minute. So a nice lazy descent. Carb heat's full off because we're still in the green. Airspeed's pretty good. It's up at cruise speed. And it's a little bumpy today, so I'm being tossed around a bit. So we're at 2,300, we'll go another 100 feet and then I'll level out. Circuit altitude is around 2,000. It's actually 186, but 2,000 is a nice round number, so just below 2,000 is circuit altitude. We'll turn left over the field. So, a quick review of the instruments. Airspeed, on average, cruise is about 90 to 100, depending on our load. Don't drop below 60, or the wings will stop flying and we'll go fall like a rock. That's stalling the wings of the airplane. So we always keep it above 60. Climbing out at 70 or 80, descending at about 70, cruise, like I said, about 90 to 100. Altimeter is set to the field elevation because of varying air pressure. You do that every single time you take off. And on long trips, you do it like every half hour, using information on the radio. Reset your gyro compass regularly to the main compass, like during level flight where they're stable. And on landing, we're going to use half flaps, which is 20 degrees. Carb heat will pull out mid downwind, so it's done, and we leave it full on all the way to the ground to minimize or reduce any chance of carb ice at a critical low level approach. We don't want the engine to quit just before we land. So, nosing it down to 2,000 feet, starting our turn. We're still going to level out 2,000, cruise RPM, cruise airspeed. Now we're going to use appropriate radio calls. If this was for real, we'd be calling our position. It's an uncontrolled airport, so we'd be making announcements to any aircraft nearby so they know what we're up to. But we're not going to bother. So we're overhead the field at circuit altitude, level flight, cruise RPM, cruise airspeed, and once we're away from the field about mid-Turtle Lake, we will turn onto downwind. So I've already pulled the carb heat out, so that's done. We don't have to worry about it. Halfway over Turtle Lake, I'll turn left, level, turn to the left, maintaining circuit altitude. And we're going to take up a heading of 200, which is opposite direction of the runway for the proper parallel downwind. Okay, we're coming up on 210 and rolling out on 200 or 200 degrees. And there's our landmark, the wider mouth of that bay on the lake. So I know I'm pointing in the right direction. Now, throttle back, lose airspeed, and pitch up. Pitch up to lose airspeed and reduce throttle so we don't, so just to help it. We're at about 60. Drop some flaps down to 20 degrees. We have to make sure the plane is going slow enough to reduce or to drop flaps. Once the airport is off at our 7 o'clock position, we can turn, do a descending turn, 500 feet per minute, turning right 90 degrees, ending up on a heading of 100. So we've done this before. And we're going to descend down to 500 feet above the ground, which is 1,368. Okay, RPM, there's Turtle Lake, there's the runway. RPM is good, carb heat's full on, airspeed is about 70 knots, it's right on the button. And we're descending and we're trimmed, so retrim this. This is not cruise, so we're retrimming for the descent. So you don't have to keep holding the yoke. Now remember, throttle works your descent rate. So if you need to, put a bit more power on so you don't fall too fast. So we're going to turn into a heading of 020. Oh, we overshot a bit. Not much, not bad. So bring it back in line. And from now on, try to use rudder for corrections. At slow speed, violent or radical moves on the ailerons can induce a stall in the wing. So right from now on, try to correct with rudder as much as you can. Airspeed's still good, it's well above the stall. Descent rate's good, line up with the runway. RPM's good, carb heat's on, airspeed's good. And once fly it right down to the runway. So we're lining up with the end of the runway. Once you're over the pavement, pull the power and pull the plane level to the pavement. I mean level. Don't go up, don't go down. As you lose airspeed, it'll tend to nose drop, so don't let it. And don't let it go too high. Have it level, 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 and hold it and wait. Let the plane land itself. There it goes. Now, put the brakes on, pull the yoke full back, lift the flaps. Lifting the flaps when you can puts more weight on the wheels. Okay, parking brake on. And at this point, normally you'd taxi in and park it, but we're not going to do that. We're going to shut off right here. Flaps are up. See? Carb heat full off, and pull the mixture. That cuts the fuel to the carburetor, and so that'll cut the engine. Turn the magnetos off and shut off the battery and the generator.